The next team on our list, we looked at the AFC West next as we were kind of going through the divisions. And there's a lot of interesting storylines in the AFC West. You can make a case for all four teams pretty easily. But as you said to me before the show, kind of a no-brainer, even within that context, is the Broncos, where they have a ton of weapons. They no longer have Noah Fant at tight end, but they drafted new tight ends, so now they have two tight ends. Some of the early talk is suggesting that the rookie Greg Dulcich might be even playing ahead of Albert O, who we like. You have Jeudy coming back from an injury-marred campaign. Courtland Sutton came back from injury last year and was very good when Jeudy was off the field, and then very poor when Jeudy was on the field, which was really odd, frankly, because you look at them as, seeing targets in different areas of the field. But Sutton's volume was very heavily correlated with whether or not Jeudy was on the field. Whether that's a causation element or not is to be determined. There's a lot of people that are pointing at it like it is causative, like Judy's presence was why Sutton didn't get volume. I'm basically throwing that split out. I'm curious your thoughts on that, but especially with a different quarterback, I don't think I want to put too much weight on those small samples from last year. And then obviously we have Tim Patrick, and then more importantly, we have KJ Hamler, the guy that we love to take in every draft. There's a lot of options in this offense, and now a new quarterback in Russell Wilson, who maybe another reason to throw out those Sutton splits. The word early in camp is that Sutton might be his favorite.
Yeah, I don't think that the relationship between Sutton and Jeudy is necessarily problematic. One of the things that we witnessed was that in 2020, when Sutton was out, Jeudy was targeted a lot more deep. He has 113 targets as a rookie. He goes over 1,500 air yards, 13.5 is the ADOT. Then you go to last season, and that collapses to just around 9, whereas Courtland Sutton targeted over 15 yards down the field, has a terrible racer as he struggles to really connect on any of those passes from either Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater there. We would expect that if he can keep that target profile in any way similar, that with Russell Wilson pulling the trigger, that a big season is potentially on the horizon. But there are some potential hiccups because depending on how the new coaching staff decides to run the offense, you could have more overlap, right? You could have Jeudy targeted a little bit more down the field. Patrick, I think, is that guy who he's a big body. He's going to be a little bit of red zone threat. In some ways, his numbers are propped up by the fact that he led this team in touchdown receptions last season, but also his usage probably will be propped up by the contract that he signed, when the reality for them is probably that Hamler should be on the field. Now, Hamler and Dulcich have been the focal point of a huge number of puff pieces coming out of Denver. That gets you, kind of excited about them, even if you know those are puff pieces. But they've been raving about Hamler's recovery, all the work that he's done, how explosive he is, how great a fit he will be with Russell Wilson, how he could be the Tyler Lockett in this offense. The reason that we picked the Broncos from this division that has 4 very interesting teams is that it's hard to see how all of these guys really can get out there on the field and get enough routes to, even if they are efficient, be someone that in redraft, for example, you would feel comfortable starting. Because I think that we're going to have the 3 or 4 game eruptions from Hamler. You look at his 10 targets last season, targeted an average of 20 yards down the field. His 7.4 yards per target, not great, but hilarious within the context of, with 10 targets, obviously it doesn't matter, but he drops
that TD
like a 70-yard touchdown or what have you. That would have changed his numbers pretty significantly.
You would have like 12 yards per target with that one play on his 10 target sample.
So we have all of that in the mix. And then I think that there's going to be more pressure from the tight ends as well. Albert O last season has a targets per route and yards per route profile that is identical to Travis Kelce. The big difference, obviously, is that Travis Kelce's route percentage is 78%. Albert O's was 35%. And then you look at that and say, well, now he's unleashed. And yeah, maybe you don't maintain those numbers when you're running 75% of the routes instead of 35% of the routes, but your quarterback upgrade is huge. How can you not maintain a lot of it when you're having the change from Teddy Bridgewater to Russell Wilson? That should make you a star. Except the coaching staff already seems to be in love with Dulcich. I mean, he's potentially going to be in an equal share or the leader. And when you combine that with the enthusiasm that Patrick Corain has had about him, then I mean, those are the two things I need to know, right? Do the coaches love him, and does Pat look? So then you say, well, I don't know how to play this. Now, it's been great because it really has neutralized Albert O's ADP. I mean, you're getting him almost for free, so I think you still have to make that bet. Even if Dulcich goes in there and gets a lot of the routes, I mean, is he going to be the relatively unique rookie tight end who actually is viable in fantasy? I mean, that seems like a stretch, especially within the context of all these other guys. But I mean, this could be tricky. I mean, this could be one where it really is more split than drafters are reflecting. There's a lot of risk, obviously, with Jeudy, even though he seems like the guy with also the most upside by far. But Courtland Sutton, maybe he does have a couple year stretch here where he can be, almost like a second round value. And if that were to happen, I mean, you're still getting a great discount. So many players, and that's before talking about Javonte Williams trying to hold off this push that Melvin Gordon says he's going to make.
But then we also have, again, the contingency-based argument in this offense, right? And so, I mean, maybe that'll be a theme of today's show, but that's, I think, the big argument for taking KJ Hamler shots late is if there were, I think it can be any of the top three receivers missing time. And we saw Jeudy miss time last year. We saw Sutton miss time the year before. Obviously, we don't expect necessarily those injuries to linger or them to be more injury prone, but just as an example, obviously, of what can happen, and Tim Patrick could also miss time. It seems, again, similar to the Dolphins' point that KJ Hamler is the very clear next man up. And the puff pieces in camp and everything suggest that. He is a part of a four-man group, at least from an outsider's perspective, that make up the top of their receiving group, and then everyone else is sort of behind that, So that does create some contingency-based upside. But you also have to factor in the two tight ends, as you talked about. And the talk is that Dulcich is going to be potentially used more as an outside. I mean, this is something that our boy Pat Corain has talked about, that Dulcich and Albert O aren't even really necessarily similar tight ends. Albert O very much an inline tight end. Dulcich has been used as a stand-up tight end a lot on the outside and split out wide throughout college. So if he's heavily involved, it might be like a little bit like Kyle Pitts' rookie season, and they might be used differently. And then you would see essentially two tight end packages. Certainly Dulcich can kick inside too, and there's this possibility that he's more traditional tight end. But anytime there's two tight ends on the field, there's only two receivers on the field, unless there's not a running back on the field. And so it still squeezes things from that perspective, right? So this contingency upside I was talking about at receiver, you can break into three receiver sets, but maybe you need to also break into two receiver sets in this offense a decent amount, because some of that contingency upside could be on Dulcich or on Albert O. So really the point I'm getting at is you kind of have six guys for four spots. And even if there is an injury, you might still have that squeezed element that you're talking about. It's challenging. And you like all of the individual profiles. I mean, the only one that I'm not really intrigued by is Tim Patrick. He just sort of seems boring, and yet the beats love to talk about Tim Patrick. Everyone that covers his team has positive things to say about Tim Patrick. I don't really see a justification for taking Tim Patrick at his ADP when KJ Hamler goes 4 or 5 rounds later, usually. Or maybe it's 3 or 4. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a couple of rounds. And I think Hamler's a better pick straight up because of the upside, of the possibility that he's a difference maker for your roster in a way that I don't know there's not a lot of scenarios for Tim Patrick to be a huge difference maker. He could be an accumulator, a decent wide receiver, but he's not going to probably be that big hit type player. Hamler has that profile. I mean, that's the guy that I just want to keep going back to and talk about. 2 great seasons. He redshirted, but then his redshirt freshman and sophomore year were both fantastic at Penn State. Goes pro as an early declare after his redshirt sophomore year, after 3 years, what we like to see. Goes in the second round of the same draft where Jeudy went in the first. And yes, like the draft capital in the first is a lot more than the second, But because they went to the same team in the same draft, I don't think people remember that Hamler was a second-round pick in his own right, viewed very favorably. We have a new coaching staff. We have all of those elements as well. But the puff pieces and all of that stuff that's coming out, like this is still a player that objectively on his own merits as a former second-round pick who has been a little bit injured, still has upside scenarios and has cases to be made that he can be a very good NFL player. And his college profile and all of that, the long view stuff suggests that. So that's a bet that at cost you like to make just with the uncertainty, right? But the cost for the stars is definitely getting up there. I'm with you where it's tough. And I mean, I love the idea of Courtland Sutton with Russell Wilson as just a incredibly accurate deep passer and the impact that can be made just from the shift of two pretty inaccurate deep passers, or in the case of Bridgewater, a guy who doesn't even necessarily want to throw deep, and Locke being a pretty wild deep passer. The impact of those guys to Wilson can just be massive on a guy with his profile, as you talked about, but the market is very aware of that. I mean, he's going incredibly high, much higher than last year, even though he didn't necessarily have a great year. He had stretches where when they were at full strength, he was sort of an afterthought in last year's offense. So I'd love to make that bet at a cheaper price, but it is problematic, as you were describing, with the number of good players in this offense and their current prices to see how they all hit. And I don't know. How are you playing it? Hamler's the clear and easy one, I think, but I don't really have, and I think Dulcich makes sense at the very end of drafts at this point with the puff pieces as well. And you can get these cheap options that have good profiles on their own merits, even though there's some uncertainty ahead of them. There's contingency value. There's reasons to be in on this offense. We talk about the haves and have-not offenses all the time. This is a have offense. This is an offense you want pieces of. It could be, the explosive offense of 2022. But the ones that are pricier, Albert O is a little bit pricier in that mid, tight end range, and certainly Sutton and Jeudy, and Sutton in particular has really gotten priced up. How are they targets? How are you playing them?
I think you have to kind of play this Gronkowski and Hernandez potential at the tight end position and be nervous about how that could squeeze out the third and fourth receivers. Tim Patrick is somebody I'm rooting really hard for. In reality, you have a player who was not expected to be what he is. He's, big body. He's a good red zone threat. He does a lot of things potentially for the team. Probably not a great fantasy option. And even though he is a lot less expensive than Sutton and Jeudy, you don't have the contingency-based upside that I think makes that a solid pick. There are a lot of good players going still in that range, and structurally, you need to make a solid pick in that range. You only get the 18 picks or the 20 picks, depending on the format that you're playing. I don't think that you can use one there on Patrick. We'll be looking at this offense very differently at midseason. We know who is healthy, who's hurt. The opportunity for Hamler to emerge is pretty exciting. It's really the perfect situation now. He has the ideal quarterback for his skill set. We'll see if he can stay healthy. I mean, you got the impression that the previous coaching staff had soured him just slightly because there had been a few little drop issues in addition to, the huge high profile drop early on in last season. I think a little bit of the fresh start with a new QB and the new coaching staff, again, it just puts him in a position where if he does perform the way that we expect, it's going to be hard for them to keep him off the field. We always say that you want to bet on the talent, even though the projections may create a value-based argument for passing on the guys. You want to have some exposure. I guess I do think that this offense could have so many players that it's going to be difficult, even with an injury. I mean, you almost need multiple injuries for this to be cleaned up to the point where you're getting truly elite volume for the best players. But if you're catching 60, 70-yard touchdown passes, which you will get from Russell Wilson, you don't have to have that 27, 28% target share. So from that perspective, again, very intriguing offense.
Definitely. And you mentioned the backs briefly. I'm still very much in on Javonte Williams as he continues to get cheaper. I wrote in Stealing Signals right after Gordon re-signed that I expected for the rest of the offseason there to be a lot more talk about the 50-50 split in 2021 than the type of talk that I was mentioning in that article, which was essentially that I think with a new coaching staff and then the evidence that the team gave us with their actions, that they weren't rushing to re-sign Gordon. They were letting him test the market and then kind of took him back late. that they were comfortable going for just with Javonte, and that there is this possibility, even if they start in a split, and even with Javonte's comments that he likes having Gordon back and they're going to be in a split and some of those things, that by week 3, week 5, they're already to a 60-40 towards Javonte or 70-30. I think that's actually probably the most likely outcome based on the all of the evidence we have. And yet there's going to be a lot more emphasis placed on what happened in 2021. And Gordon was good in 2021, and rightfully so. Like, he should get that credit. And yet I think based on what they did this offseason and the change in the coaching staff, you have to look at the 2022 being potentially different. And like I said, I mean, it could very much be a 50-50 the whole year, but I think we're going to shift towards more Javonte as the season goes. There's multiple ways that could happen, right? Gordon has not always been the picture of health. He was last year very healthy. He also could then this year not be as good as last year. He was good last year, but like the age cliff does come for everyone. He's a year older now. I mean, like I said, a lot of ways that could happen. You want the ascending young player. The 21-year-old rookie last year going into his age 22 second season is just a profile of running back you want to target when he's been as productive, or, you know, was as good on a sort of a per touch basis. We've talked about some of the advanced metrics. I know you've looked at some of the great info at RotoViz and shared with us on the show before about how good he was last year. So as he continues to slip now into the third round, I think he's just a really easy target personally.